The scrapyard stretched toward the horizon, a wasteland of corrugated iron and jagged skeletal machines. Acid rain had etched deep, weeping furrows into every surface, leaving the ground slick with oily residue. Beneath a mountain of discarded steel, something massive waited. It was a phoenix, hunched in the shadows, its wings shattered into jagged, irregular plates. The iron was pockmarked by decades of oxidation, the metal flaking away in brittle sheets that crunched under the weight of passing time. Its claws were locked into the cracked concrete, frozen in an eternal downward drag. Once, this structure had possessed a soaring reach, but now it was a hollow shell, stripped of its grace and buried in the silence of the yard. No wind stirred here. The air held the bitter, metallic tang of decay. Gravity seemed to press harder against the twisted frame, pulling the broken feathers toward the earth. It was a monument to neglect, a ghost of a forgotten machine, waiting in the dark for a purpose that had long since vanished from the world. A shadow detached itself from the row of rusted shipping containers. The artist moved with a measured, deliberate gait, boots crunching through the layer of pulverized glass and grit. He did not look at the surrounding wreckage. His gaze stayed fixed on the hunched, iron form ahead. He stopped inches from the primary wing, where the metal had sheared into a jagged, serrated edge. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering for a second before pressing against the cold, corroded surface. He traced the line of a broken feather, feeling the depth of the pitting. With his other hand, he gripped a loose, vibrating plate and gave it a firm, testing tug. It held, but the sound of grinding metal echoed through the yard. He circled the frame, his steps rhythmic and quiet. He pulled a notebook from his pocket, scribbling a rapid series of measurements while his eyes scanned the fractured joints. Where others saw only industrial waste, he tracked the anatomy of a dormant structure. He tapped a finger against a central support beam, listening to the resonance. The silence of the yard remained, but the intent had changed. The Phoenix was no longer just a pile of scrap. It was a puzzle waiting to be solved. The heavy machinery rolled into position, its engine a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the cracked concrete. The artist signaled the operator, his hands sweeping upward in a sharp, decisive arc. From the crane, thick steel chains descended, their links clanking against the silence like a tolling bell. They were looped around the central support beams of the Iron Phoenix, sliding through gaps where feathers had long ago rotted away. When the winch engaged, the chains went taut, digging into the corrosion with a sharp, piercing screech. The entire frame groaned, a deep, metallic protest that echoed across the yard. For a heartbeat, the Phoenix did not move. It fought the pull, rooted in decades of settled debris. Then, with a sudden, violent crack of concrete, the claws broke free. Dust and rusted flakes showered the ground in a dense brown cloud. The crane arm strained, its hydraulic pistons hissing under the immense load. Slowly, the massive iron structure rose. It swayed against the gray sky, rotating as the wind caught its jagged wings. It drifted away from the tomb of scrap, suspended in the air, beginning the slow, precarious descent toward the flatbed truck waiting on the periphery. The flatbed truck rumbled through the threshold, its tires clicking against the polished concrete of the workshop floor. The facility was a stark contrast to the scrapyard. Bright, climate-controlled, and silent. The crane operators maneuvered the Phoenix into the center of the bay, lowering it onto heavy-duty steel trestles. The iron frame settled with a final, heavy thud that echoed against the white walls. The artist walked the perimeter, checking the anchor points. He reached for a heavy rubber hose coiled by the wall. He turned a dial on the main console, and the air filled with the sharp, mechanical whine of a pressurized pump. He stepped back, gripped the nozzle, and pulled the trigger. A concentrated jet of water erupted from the tip, striking the iron surface with the force of a hammer. It hit the decades of caked grime and rust, shredding the crust instantly. Brown, viscous sludge cascaded off the metal, pooling on the floor and flowing toward the drainage grates. The artist swept the nozzle back and forth, tracing the contours of the wings. Beneath the cascading water, the dull gray iron began to emerge, stripped of its long-held layer of decay. The purification had begun. The water died away, leaving the Phoenix glistening and wet. But the deepest scars of time remained. The oxidation had fused with the iron, creating a tough, uneven crust that no spray could shift. The artist set the nozzle aside and reached for the angle grinder. He pulled the trigger, and the tool surged to life, a high-pitched scream that cut through the silence of the workshop. He pressed the spinning disc against the iron wing. The collision was instantaneous and violent. A fan of orange sparks erupted from the point of contact, showering the concrete floor like molten rain. The artist leaned into the weight of the machine, his muscles locked against the vibration. The grinding disc bit into a stubborn layer of decay, stalling for a split second before the metal gave way. He pushed harder, moving the blade in rhythmic, sweeping arcs. The air filled with the sharp scent of ozone and burning dust. As the abrasive edge tore through the final, thickest layer of rust, the surface beneath finally surrendered. A bright, raw streak of gray iron appeared, gleaming under the harsh overhead lights. The artist continued the work, clearing away the last remnants of the past, section by section, until the true form of the metal lay exposed. With the surface cleared, the structural rot became undeniable. Where the wings had snapped, jagged voids remained, leaving the iron frame brittle and disconnected. The artist donned his protective mask, the darkened glass turning the world into a narrow, focused tunnel of gray. He grabbed the welding torch. He tapped the tip against the frame, and a violent, brilliant blue arc snapped to life. Light flooded the workshop, casting deep, dancing shadows against the walls. He brought the flame to the first fracture, the metal melting instantly under the intense heat. He fed a rod of new iron into the pool, watching as the molten material flowed into the cavity, bridging the gap between the old pitted metal. It was a violent dance of fire and steel. Every pass left a ridge of glowing molten beads that pulsed with a dull orange heat. He moved with steady, practiced rhythm, stitching the skeleton back together. When the arc flared, the air hissed. When he pulled away, the cooling weld crusted over with a thin, dark slag. He worked around the curve of the wing, reinforcing the joints until the iron frame hummed with renewed rigidity. The Phoenix was no longer a collection of broken parts, but a single, solid entity held together by the strength of the weld. With the structural core locked in place, the artist set aside the heavy welding gear. He picked up a hardened steel file and a small, pointed chisel. The transformation moved from the macro to the micro. He began with the beak, which had been flattened and distorted by decades of pressure. He placed the chisel edge against the metal and tapped the handle with a mallet, shaving away layers of oxidized scale with rhythmic, controlled strikes. Each stroke was a negotiation with history. He spent an hour on the curvature of the upper mandible alone, refining the sharp angle until it caught the light. He then moved to the talons, where the metal had bent into a jagged, unnatural sprawl. He used a heavy metal file, pushing the rough, abrasive surface back and forth until the edges smoothed into a predatory, curved point. He found a stubborn, calcified fissure hidden deep within a claw joint, requiring him to switch to a fine-toothed rasp to clear the debris. The metal groaned under the friction, but he pressed on, carving away the damage to reveal the original sculptor's intent. He worked the surface, etching intricate, feather-like patterns back into the iron plates. The Phoenix began to hold the weight of its own history once more, its form regaining a sense of dignity that had been buried under the rust for half a century. The artist laid down his files and stepped back, his eyes tracing the silhouette of the Phoenix. The iron was clean, but it was still dead, a gray, lifeless husk waiting for its rebirth. He began the final phase with a chemical wash, wiping away the microscopic dust of his own labor. He loaded a spray gun with a deep, charcoal-toned primer, moving in long, sweeping arcs until the entire statue was coated in a uniform matte shadow. As he inspected the work, his hand caught a slight ripple in the wing base. He stopped, grabbed a block of fine grit sandpaper, and worked the metal until the surface was perfectly flush. He nodded, satisfied. He switched to the golden finish, the compressor humming to life with a steady, rising pitch. He pulled the trigger. A fine mist of liquid bronze coated the iron, instantly transforming the dull surface into a warm, metallic glow. Layer upon layer followed. As the bronze dried, he switched to the final gold plating, spraying in thin, overlapping passes. The light in the workshop caught the wet surface, refracting in brilliant, blinding flashes. The Phoenix shed its industrial past, the dull gray vanishing beneath a radiant, gilded shell. The metal seemed to catch fire, glowing with an inner intensity that turned the workshop into a temple of light. It was no longer scrap, it was a beacon. The wings remained detached, two massive iron crescents leaning against the workshop wall. Each weighed more than a man could lift alone. The artist mobilized the overhead crane, lowering the heavy steel cables until the hooks groaned under the tension. He guided the first wing into the air, the metal frame swinging with a slow, deliberate momentum that threatened to shatter the workshop windows. He maneuvered the wing toward the torso, but the primary mounting pin refused to seat. The angle was off by a fraction of an inch. He braced his shoulder against the iron, muscles straining as he forced the massive structure into alignment. The metal shrieked against metal. With a final sharp impact, the bolt slid home. He repeated the process for the second wing, his focus absolute as he locked the bracing struts into place. The Phoenix was no longer a fragmented collection of parts. The wings stretched wide, straining toward the rafters, their span filling the upper reaches of the room. The artist stepped back, his breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. He wiped the grime from his forehead, looking up at the silhouette. The Phoenix stood whole, its posture defiant and poised, ready to break free from the confines of the workshop and reclaim its place under the open sky. The heavy flatbed truck rolled into the center of the plaza just as the horizon began to bleed thin lines of violet and amber. The artist signaled the crane operators. They worked in silence, the only sound the rhythmic clanking of chains and the distant hum of the waking city. They positioned the Phoenix on its permanent pedestal, the iron feet locking into the stone floor with a final, heavy thud. As the first true light of dawn crested the buildings, the crew pulled the ropes. The heavy canvas covering slumped to the ground, pooling like discarded skin. The Phoenix stood exposed. For a heartbeat, the statue remained dim, a silhouette against the morning mist. Then, the sun cleared the rooftop. The golden plating ignited. Light bounced from every etched feather, scattering across the plaza and catching the lenses of hovering drones. The reflection was blinding, a sharp, golden flare that cut through the gray morning air. The wings, fully extended, seemed to catch the rising heat, holding the warmth of the new day. It was no longer a relic of a scrapyard. It was a monument to persistence, standing tall as the city noise began to swell around it. The artist watched from the edge of the crowd, his work finished. The legend had arrived.